big situation now in the East Caribbean and the Pacific, an escalating situation with US military forces hitting alleged drug boats, with a big build-up of US military forces, Navy, aircraft, Marines, and also with a very aggressive diplomacy, quite openly pushing for a regime change in Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro. So I'm going to, in this video, get into what's happening, break down what we really know about this situation and about where it could lead. Now, whenever you bring in President Donald J. Trump, this gets some emotive reactions. A lot of people are against anything that Donald J. Trump says or does. Other people are in favor of anything Trump does or says. And also with Venezuela, this gets very emotive reactions from the people of Venezuela and from the 7 million people who have left Venezuela in the last decade as well. So I'm going to try in this video to be as down the line as I can, to look at the facts and to analyze really what is going on here. It's quite complicated, the situation, because it brings in two big conflicts. One is the war on drugs, and this brings in a new phase really of the war on drugs, a new doctrine of striking dead alleged drug traffickers. And the other situation is more about the Venezuelan government, about the people of Venezuela, about trying to change the government in that country, potential electoral fraud, malnutrition, and a history of US regime changes around the world. And these two are intertwined because the US government accuses Venezuela of being involved in drug trafficking, and we'll get into these issues here. So this video will have 5 sections. The first will look at the offensive right now in terms of hitting the drug boats and the build-up of forces and the diplomacy. Second section will look at who are these drug gangs involved, Tren de Aragua, Cartel de los Soles, and links to the Venezuelan government. The third section will look at the Venezuelan government itself and the situations of malnutrition, electoral fraud, and their own defense and coming back on the US aggressions. The fourth section will look at where this will lead, this new chapter in the war on drugs. And the fifth section will look at the potential US invasion of Venezuela or not, or other efforts to change the government there. If you like these videos and you want to see more of them coming, it makes a real big difference if you subscribe to this, totally free, wherever you get your videos. I've got some really good guests coming on, some great stories. We can't do this without you. So this offensive, the main core of the offensive, has been these strikes on the alleged drug boats. So these began on September the 2nd, and up till the date we're recording, there's been 10 strikes so far. And these have been, most of them have been on small boats, what are known as go-fast boats or speed boats. But there have also been one on a semi-submersible. These kind of makeshift submarines, what I've talked about in other videos as being narco submarines. The information about these strikes is mainly coming from the US government. Donald J. Trump often will make declarations of these strikes on his Truth Social. They'll be on Twitter and they'll release videos showing these hits. They appear to be coming from Hellfire missiles, and there's other US military missiles which will be coming from helicopters or from drones or from other mechanisms. And so far there's been, according to the US counts, 43 deaths. Now we're also getting information about these strikes from governments, Venezuela, Colombia, Trinidad, Tobago, Ecuador, and we're getting words from some people who have survived some of these strikes as well as family members. Now 8 of these have been in the Caribbean, and 2 of them have now been in the Pacific as well. We don't have all of the exact locations, but one of these was located to the town of Sucre in Venezuela, going towards Trinidad and Tobago. Some of them leaving Colombia and other places around this area. And the victims have included Venezuelans, Trinidadians, Colombians, and people from Ecuador as well. Along with the strikes, you've had some harsh language from the United States, this idea that we're going to hit and kill drug traffickers, and we're justifying this because they're bringing drugs into the United States. And these attacks have also been accompanied by some pretty harsh rhetoric from the Trump administration officials. We have Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, or as he says, is now the Secretary of War, and he said this. He said, if you are a narco-terrorist smuggling drugs in the hemisphere, we will treat you like we treat Al-Qaeda. Day or night, we will map your networks, track your people, hunt you down and kill you. So we've got some harsh rhetoric going with there. They haven't given a lot of information about the drugs on board, but as we'll get into later, this is almost exclusively cocaine moving around this region. And also they've given, alleged, they're saying these are from certain gangs like the Tren de Aragua or Cartel de los Soles, but they haven't given a lot of any evidence to show or back those claims. However, there is a lot of people who move drugs around these region on boats for many years. It's very common there. Now, the second big part of this is this build up of military vessels. So we already had 8 big ships plus a nuclear submarine that have been put into the Caribbean, and on top of that we've now got the USS Gerald Ford, which is going there and is going to be the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world. They haven't given an exact number of troops, but there's believed to be quite a high number, above 10,000, perhaps 15,000 plus, including Marines, Navy sailors, and so forth. As well as the military build-up, there's been some aggressive rhetoric going towards Venezuela and towards Nicolas Maduro. So they saw a rising of a price on his head. They put a price on Nicolas Maduro's head, accusing him of being involved with drug cartels. And Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, said under President Trump's leadership, Maduro will not escape justice and he will be held accountable for his despicable crimes. So quite openly there, pushing for a change of government in Venezuela, along with these strikes on the drug boats, which have now, up to the date we're speaking, killed 43 people. So this area is almost exclusively for trafficking, an area of cocaine. It's been the Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, these South American countries have been the heartland of cocaine trafficking going back to the 1970s. This is not an area for fentanyl. Now, I guess this is important because most of the deaths in the United States of drug overdoses are linked to fentanyl, about 70% linked to fentanyl. Also, the second highest is crystal meth, people with crystal meth in their system, and then cocaine is in third place. And when it's cocaine, it's often because they're linked to other things if they have cocaine mixed with fentanyl. Now, the groups involved, we have El Tren de Aragua. Now, El Tren de Aragua, which became a bit of a household name during the election of 2024 that Donald Trump won, is a gang which originated from Venezuela. It was very much initially began from people doing shakedowns, extortion payments over a train project under President Chavez of Venezuela. Then it grew inside a prison, became a prison gang, and then as many Venezuelans left the country, it spread around the hemisphere, including to the United States. Now, the Tren de Aragua is a violent, vicious, predatory gang. And there were some real cases in the United States of Tren de Aragua members involved in things like attacking police officers, kidnappings, and there's a famous video of them holding guns in some apartments. At the same time, they're not a big cartel or organization involved in drug trafficking in a really big way. So some of the accusations that this boat was alleged to be from a Tren de Aragua boat moving cocaine has to take with quite a lot of caution, because they are more of a street gang, particularly involved in sometimes selling drugs, but also involved in pimping prostitutes. That's one of their biggest things, as well as kind of robberies and shakedowns and stuff. Now, a second group is El Cartel de los Soles. El Cartel de los Soles is a cartel which was formed in Venezuela among Venezuelan military officers. Now, there's an indictment on this, and it says the name of the Cartel de los Soles is a reference to the sun insignias affixed to the uniforms of high-ranking Venezuelan military officials who are members of the cartel. And this has been around for 25 years, even more, since former President Hugo Chavez first won election in Venezuela, going back to 1998. You had these military officials involved in moving cocaine, and from what I understand in my reporting, this seems credible, these accusations. I heard about the military officials being very involved in allowing cartel planes to leave Venezuela to take cocaine north. So Cartel de Soles are linked to trafficking, but again, we don't really know exactly if they're involved in these particular boats. And it's hard to know sometimes if, when they talk about we're hitting a certain boat, we have the greatest intel, we've got the CIA involved in this, but you don't really know if they really have agents in all these organizations and have all the intel, or if they've spotted this from the sky, from radars, they've spotted these type of boats moving over the sea, and then they've gone in and targeted to hit them. Now, you also have other groups in the scenario here. You have Colombian traffickers and Colombian supposedly left-wing guerrilla groups, although many of them really don't care about ideology as much as just trafficking drugs. You have the remnants of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. They were meant to disband in a peace deal, but you still have remnants of them working and moving around. And they've also worked with the Venezuelan government. You have other guerrilla groups like the ELN as well, which are also supposedly kind of Marxist, left-wing revolutionaries, but really involved in moving cocaine and with links to the Venezuelan government. And then you have the Venezuelan government itself being accused of trafficking drugs, and the charges against Nicolas Maduro, and a $50 million price on his head from the United States. Now, there's a big indictment in 2020 against Nicolas Maduro. They accuse him of narco-terrorism as well as narco-trafficking. And the accusations here are credible that he was involved in moving drugs. However, still, this looks to be more of a political operation than a law enforcement operation. A political operation against the Venezuelan government. So Venezuela is ruled by Nicolas Maduro, who's the successor of Hugo Chavez, and they've been running what they call a democratic socialist movement, where they describe it as Bolivarian socialism, of trying to move the country to be more in favor of the poor. This is their own rhetoric. Now, under President Hugo Chavez, he was very popular and he did genuinely win elections. However, under Nicolas Maduro, he's been more and more unpopular, and almost certainly won the last election in 2024 with electoral fraud. So there was an opposition candidate, Maria Corina Machado, who was very popular, who was not allowed to run. So they put a replacement running in her name, basically Edmundo Gonzalez. And according to people who are working for their opposition movement, who are at the polling booths and counting votes, they say they won 67% to 30%. They won the 2024 election. And some other international organizations are saying this has been the case. Now, Nicolas Maduro denies this, but I think there's a pretty high chance this is the way it was a very unpopular situation, very unpopular government. Now, at the same time, with the economic situation under Hugo Chavez, and a very important fact about Venezuela, we can't forget, is Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the entire planet. Under Hugo Chavez, there was a rising price of oil, and there was an improvement in life for some of the poorer people in Venezuela. There was a lot of handouts to them, including sometimes handouts of washing machines and houses, sometimes cash handouts to the poorer section, and a certain rising in the economy during the 2000s. However, in the 2010s, things were absolutely disastrous for Venezuela, and you saw the economy absolutely shattered, people going to malnutrition levels, destruction of the economy by 80% of GDP, people not having enough food to eat, and 7 million people leaving the country. You also had some US sanctions on Venezuela, which exacerbated this situation. However, I've been on the streets covering this in Venezuela, in this crisis, and you saw the economy was run absolutely terribly internally in Venezuela, and you can't say that Nicolas Maduro has no responsibility for that malnutrition and that exodus. At the same time, the idea of US regime change, or the US going into Venezuela on behalf of the opposition and taking out the government, gets into very shaky territory. If we look at the history of US regime change, we go back in Latin America to Guatemala in the 1950s with Jacobo Arbenz. We go to 1973 in Chile with President Allende, and we see very dodgy situations. Also more recently in Iraq in 2003, in Afghanistan, we see often disastrous situations coming from the US going to these countries and saying, we're going to change the government of your country, working with opposition. So this gets into very difficult territory. Now, there is one, you could say, success story which people are citing, which is the invasion of Panama in 1989. This has some similarities with Venezuela. The president of Panama was Noriega, President Manuel Noriega, known as Pineapple Face, he had this pockmarked face. Like Maduro, he was also accused of drug trafficking, and there was an invasion in Panama which took him out pretty fast, and then they replaced the government, and Panama has been reasonably successful. However, there's a bunch of ways that Venezuela is very different from Panama. So what are the implications for this for the war on drugs? This certainly really means a new phase, a new doctrine in the war on drugs. So the war on drugs, we say this began back in 1971 under Richard Nixon. Started saying the drugs were public enemy number one, and there'd be a global effort using all different government agencies, military, law enforcement, creating the DEA to go after drug traffickers. And then you saw different phases in this. You had Ronald Reagan, and then using the US Navy to stop boats over the Caribbean, then bring it in into Miami and Florida, so traffickers switched to moving it through Mexico, and different phases. And this is a new phase of saying, well, we're just gonna, not only gonna have DEA agents and military, stopping boats and arresting people, we're just gonna strike you down. We're just gonna hit you with a Hellfire missile from the air. So that's a pretty crazy new phase in this. Now, there's a big legal question about this. Donald Trump has designated various drug cartels and gangs, including Tren de Aragua, including Cartel de Sinaloa, and various groups as foreign terrorist organizations. So that, puts them in a different level. At the same time, it doesn't immediately give legal backing for a Hellfire missile strike on a boat. So they're using the idea, or the administration is having a defense of saying, well, they are attacking the United States by trying to bring drugs into our country. And that's our justification for this. But people say, well, this is like an extrajudicial execution. Extrajudicial meaning it's an execution, they're giving a death penalty, but without any trial, without a court case. And this raises some questions. People aren't going to do much, or countries are not rising to attack the United States over this. But is it in the US interest to be in this legally questionable framework and be basically striking down boats with missiles? Can the US sustain that in the long term? Now, Donald Trump has said, there is not a lot of boats out in the water. I can't imagine why. Saying this is acting very much as a deterrent. I think that's true. We can't deny that's true. If this suddenly raises the stakes massively, if you're trafficking cocaine and you can be hit from the sky by a missile, that is changing the equation. But traffickers can still find other ways to move drugs through overland and so forth. We'll see if it's really able to stop them bring it into the country, and they find other ways that they can try and make cocaine in different places. They're already making some cocaine in Mexico, for example. The second thing is, this is the real big drug problem the last few years has been around fentanyl. So if you look at the overdose deaths in the United States, about 70% of the victims of overdose deaths had some kind of opioid like fentanyl inside their body. Next was crystal meth. Some of them had combinations of drugs in their body, but next was crystal meth. And cocaine was in a third place. So it's not really attacking the main drug issue of the United States. And we don't see this attached to some kind of bigger strategy of saying, okay, we're going to have more drug rehab, more drug prevention. What's the biggest strategy here? So this has certainly opened a new door, a new phase of the war on drugs. But it's taking shape, and we're going to see where this goes and what the results are going to be and how long the United States can keep this up. But also we have this other, perhaps the core mission at this point, of the regime change in Venezuela. So where will these efforts to regime change Venezuela lead? Now, there's various lines of where it could go that don't actually involve a US invasion. There could be a coup, and basically from the rhetoric of the Trump administration, they're really trying to openly encourage that. You could have Venezuelan generals who arrest Maduro, take him out, hand him to US authorities, or negotiate him leaving the country, and then the government changes. However, that could be quite tough, because actually over the years, the Venezuelan government has got a lot of the generals pretty on side. A lot of them have been given businesses, given things like sugar haciendas and various sugar mills as businesses. And you also see some of these generals, some of these military officers are also indicted or accused in the same accusations in the United States. And so they could risk themselves being arrested and don't want to suddenly have a regime change there in Venezuela. You could also have a popular uprising, people going on the streets and taking to the streets and trying to bring the government down. That's a very common thing that happens, encouraged by CIA agents as well. However, so far we haven't seen any signs of this. And one thing is that the Venezuelans, apart from having 7 million people who've left the country, including many people who would have been the kind of opposition people, you've also got people who are very scared about taking to the streets. Because they could be arrested or disappeared. Who's going to be the first out there right now? Pretty tense situation. Then you could have a kind of special forces mission to take out Maduro, a US special forces mission. Might sound a bit like from the movie Sicario, but they're certainly wargaming this right now in the Pentagon about looking at this. But that could be pretty high risk as well. That could go wrong. And if you send in US special forces, and they were killed or arrested, that's a lot of egg on the face of Trump. So that's kind of high risk thing to do. And then we got the US invasion. Now, the invasion of Panama, which they called Operation Just Cause, they did that with about 27,000 troops. It was pretty low cost to the Americans. They lost about 23 American military personnel. They eventually, President Noriega holed up. A lot of Panamanians were killed. President Noriega held up in the Vatican embassy, and they blasted him out with rock music. They were playing Guns N' Roses repeatedly until he came out, and they arrested him, took him to the United States, and convicted him. But Venezuela is a much bigger country. It's a much bigger country, and there's estimates that it could need at least 100,000 troops, and maybe more. Now, how would the Venezuelan military respond if there was a full-on US invasion? Would some of the soldiers throw their guns down? Maybe, but these are factors we don't know. And there's also other groups as well as the military. They're militias, which are people who are kind of socialist activists, Chavista activists, who could fight as well, who are more dedicated. And various guerrilla groups, Colombian guerrilla groups linked to the Venezuelan government, who could also be taking shots at US troops. So a lot of unknown factors there. And the issue with this, I mean, you know, it could be something that happens fairly fast, but also this could go really wrong. And then we get into US politics. You have Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, whose family are Cubans, who left Cuba, who's quite into this idea of, you know, taking out these, what they call authoritarian left-wing governments in Latin America. They feel if Venezuela goes, then maybe Nicaragua and Cuba could go as well. And Trump has them in one ear, but then also Trump is somebody who, I don't know if he want to take this kind of risk in a foreign adventure that could end up being really central to his administration. And the thing about wars, and we've seen this, Russia invading Ukraine, thought it could take out Ukraine very quickly, and that's been going on for years. The Iraq war. So you never know when wars happen. They can go on a long time, they can go very wrong, and a lot of people can die. Being a narco journalist is a lot of blood and sweat and beers. So if you want to keep these videos coming, then you can support this for completely free by subscribing on whatever platform you're watching this on. And you can go to www.crashoutmedia.com, where you're going to see all kinds of news and analysis and reports and be the best informed in the room about the drug war. And if you want to support this, then you can for just $5 a month, the price of a cup of coffee.